In August 1978, on a semi-rural property on Sydney's suburban fringe, a disturbing chain of events is about to unfold that will end with the brutal slaying of a young mother and her two children. Valda Connell, her 10-year-old daughter Sally, and 4-year-old son Damien arrive home, disturbing a known violent criminal ransacking their house.
Don't move! Stay in the car!
He abducts them, drives them to isolated areas across northern New South Wales, where he will abuse, taunt, and eventually kill all three.
It's okay, Sally.
And although police will catch up with him, his reign of terror and the pain inflicted on the surviving family members will not end there. In the 1970s, Baulkham Hills in Sydney's northwest was one of the city's fastest growing residential areas, with rural and semi-rural properties being replaced with housing estates and affordable project homes. While the surrounding landscape changed from fields to suburban lots, the Connell family, Paul, Valda, and their 6 children live on one of the few remaining rural properties.
For us as kids, I think it was a pretty perfect life. Really looking back, you don't realise how well off we were and how lucky we were to have 56 acres, and we had cows and horses and goats and a pig even that we won at the fete, and ducks, and we used to go eeling over at the dam, and you know, life was so safe. It was so innocent, I suppose, living like that.
We're a very close family, even though it was myself and then 4 sisters. Before I finally got a brother. But yeah, we still were very close. We had to enjoy each other's company, and I think that we did do that, and that was, I suppose, also largely that my parents nurtured us in that sort of supportive way.
Life for the Connell family is like living in a conservative country town, even though they're just 30 kilometres from Sydney's CBD. They enjoy a close bond with other families in the area, often inviting them on excursions to the beach. The Connells are also a religious family, and it's a very important part of their life. They attend Mass every Sunday and say the Rosary together each night.
The church was important to all of us as a family. Both Mum and Dad were strong in the church, and again, those values were instilled on us. It was a community thing, but I guess it was the way they lived their lives. They were very moral people who actually acted in a very Christian way and tried to help others and people in the community.
Friday, the 11th of August, 1978, was just another day for Valda Connell.
Hey, almost there, honey.
The 39-year-old mother of 6 had spent the day doing housework, playing tennis with friends, and caring for her 4-year-old son, Damien. That afternoon, Valda takes Damien to collect her second youngest child, Sally, aged 10, from school.
Here she comes, Damien.
Valda's other children are old enough to make their own way home.
Hi, Sally. How was your day, honey?
Good. We did a cool science project.
Uh-huh.
While Valda is collecting Sally from school, a new resident to the area is prowling the streets. He's recently paroled armed robber John Ernest Cribb.
Cribb, after being released on parole, part of the conditions of his parole was that he was to stay with his parents at Killabar Creek. But sometime after that he left and went to stay with his sister at Balcombe Hills. On this particular Friday, which was the 11th of August, Cribb was at home and he decided to go out, and he left the sister's premises and wandered the streets, went to a local hotel, consumed a quantity of alcohol, slightly intoxicated, and then he reverted to what he knew best, and that was committing crime.
Cribb leaves the hotel at around 2:30 in the afternoon. Stuffed down his trousers is a knife. He would later tell police that he bought the knife soon after his release, explaining it was for his own protection. Cribb is now looking for a house to break into. His first 3 attempts are unsuccessful, deterred by watchful neighbours and some barking dogs. He eventually comes to the Connell house. It's isolated, with no neighbours close by. Cribb goes to the backyard and cuts away a fly screen to gain entry.
He then went through the premises, stole a large amount of property, suitcases and other electrical equipment, and a 12-gauge shotgun. After he'd been in the home for a while, he then walked to the front gate and he put the property, the suitcases and other bits and pieces of property, near the front gate, probably with the intention of, after he'd completed whatever he was doing in the house, to gather the property together and leave the area.
As Cribb leaves the house, Valda Connell and her 2 children arrive home. They're totally unaware of Cribb's presence or that anything is wrong. At this moment, there are many things running through Cribb's head, but foremost in his mind is his newfound freedom. He doesn't want to get caught. Cribb makes his move.
Stay in the car! Stay in the car! Shut up! I'm taking the car! You're coming with me!
Even though he's been surprised, Cribb has already started planning his next move. What he does next will horrify our nation and turn this burglar into one of Australia's most notorious criminals. On a winter's afternoon in August 1978, 39-year-old Valda Connell has arrived at her Balcombe Hills home in northwest Sydney with her 10-year-old daughter Sally and her 4-year-old son Damien. What they don't know is that they've disturbed recently paroled armed robber John Ernest Cribb during a break-and-enter at their home. Hearing the car pull up, Cribb is trapped. He makes a decision. Whatever it takes, he's not going back inside.
Don't move! Don't move! Stay in the car! Shut up! Shut up! I just robbed your house!
Car, don't hurt us!
Just robbed your house! Don't move! Move over! Move over! Don't move! Stay in the car! Don't look at me! Stay in the car! Don't move! Don't move!
He picks up the stolen property he'd left by the front gate and throws it in the boot.
Stay in the car! Stay in the goddamn car!
Then jumps in the driver's seat and makes his escape. Cribb wants to get away from Balcombe Hills fast because he doesn't want to risk any locals seeing him in the Connells' car. And so he drives Valda and her frightened young children north, arriving at Barara Waters on the Hawkesbury River, north of Sydney. It's a location he hasn't chosen by accident. You see, this is where Cribb's girlfriend lives, and he knows the area well.
Yeah, John Ernest Cribb did have a long criminal record. Even from a young person, he'd been in and out of jail on several occasions, had a lot of dealings with the police for criminal activity. At the time of this crime, he was actually out on parole, having been sentenced to 12 years for armed robbery. And it's quite interesting when you look at those armed robberies that there's a similarity in the type of facts of those armed robberies to this particular case. In that in those armed robberies he broke into homes, took people hostage and then decamped in the motor vehicle from the home. So there was a similarity in those crimes to the ones that he committed now.
The area where Cribb chooses to stop is hidden from the main roads. He's sure there won't be anyone around to disturb him.
Hey! See this? This is boss. If you go anywhere, I will hurt the kids. You listen to this, okay?
Okay.
Okay?
Okay, just don't hurt the kids. Just.
This is boss,
Yep.
all right?
Okay.
He's boss, so don't go anywhere. Say yes.
Okay,
He will find
yes,
you.
okay. You'll find it.
Pass me that. Hurry up, pass it.
Cribb sees one of Valda's dresses on the back seat and gets Sally to hand it over to him, and then proceeds to cut it into long strips. Valda stays quiet and tries to remain calm, doing whatever Cribb asks without argument.
Get out of the car. Get out of the car! You stay here. All right, that's enough. Come on, let's go. Come on.
Sally can only watch on helplessly as
You
Cribb
stay here.
threatens and manhandles her mother and 4-year-old brother,
Sit down.
binding their hands and feet and gagging them with the strips of torn material.
Stay there. Hands. Hands.
It's all right, Sally.
Not making it easy for me, are you? Come, stay still. Stay still.
When he's finished, he returns to the car and then drives off with Sally.
Remember, I've got your kid, so don't try anything.
Cribb now makes a very calculated move. He drives to a nearby service station where he forces young Sally to give him her home telephone number. He calls Valda's husband Paul, and using the alias Warren, he tells him that he and Valda are having an affair, and she and the 2 children have run away with him.
The idea of saying this was just part of a cover-up to give him time to make good his escape, trying to make out that this was a domestic issue and that the wife and the children had left, which was totally, completely out of character for this family.
Cribb's attempt to buy himself some time doesn't go to plan. Paul Connell immediately contacts police, and their response is swift.
I came home and I saw the uniformed police there in the driveway. I wasn't sure what the problem was at first, and then I saw Linda standing there with the policeman, and I got out of the car and she said, someone's taken Mum and the kids, and Sally and Damien. And I suppose it's sort of disbelief as to what are you talking about? How could this happen? And And then I remember walking in and there was quite a few people there already at that stage, just a few relatives. This, in hindsight, probably was about an hour and a half after they'd gone. And there was a state of confusion in the house. As I say, unsure what to do or what was going to happen next.
I remember Dad sitting on the veranda, looking out to the stars, and I remember saying to him, "Don't worry, Dad, when they come home we'll have a big party," because I was very young and very naive. Well, innocent. We lived in an age of innocence.
Police quickly begin their investigation, and crime scene examinations of the Connell house uncover fingerprints left by the kidnapper. But in 1978, matching fingerprints to those on record was a manual task, and that could take as long as 2 weeks. The best chance police have of finding Valda and her children is to find the vehicle, and Cribb knew this.
Messages were sent out all over the state to look for this motor vehicle and a description of the occupants. Police were advised in all areas to search motel car parks and places where somebody might stay overnight.
Been out of 20 minutes already.
Cribb can't be sure Valda's husband hasn't contacted the police, so he waits until dark and then sets off with Valda and her 2 children. He heads north, travelling the quieter inland roads to avoid detection. However, less than 50 kilometres north of Barara Waters, at a place called Central Mangrove, the car runs out of petrol. Cribb forces Valda to push the car off the road and into a clearing. The children remain in the vehicle.
Harder! God damn it! Push! Harder, for Christ's sake!
He turns to Valda, who's exhausted from pushing, and grabs the young mother of 6. Threatening the lives of her 2 young children, he overpowers the slim-built mother and pushes her to the ground. Cribb rips at Valda's clothing,
Please don't do this.
holds the knife to her throat and rapes her.
Remember who's boss? Remember?
As best we can determine, the children were bound and gagged back at the Mangrove Mountain area when Cribb forced the mother from the car and sexually assaulted her. And it's not known whether the children actually saw the rape take place, but it's a reasonable hypothesis that they did.
Remember, who's boss? Who's boss? Be quiet.
He told us that the whole time the mother was pleading with him, not so much for herself, but for the safety of her children. She was asking for protection for the children, that they wouldn't be hurt or injured. And she tried to talk to him. They're a very religious family, and at several times he indicated that she talked to him about religion. But obviously this had no effect on him at all.
After the assault, Cribb goes searching for petrol, leaving his 3 victims tied up in the vehicle.
Having been threatened by him, and the fact that he's a control freak, and the fact that he's got a criminal background, and the fact that the mother had been interfered with in front of the children, she would be under a great deal of stress and anxiety. She would be terrified to do anything except do what he said. She was totally under his control. And I feel a lot of sympathy for her in her position because she just couldn't do anything.
It's a trait that's pretty much common within the criminal element, more so in some than others. But they seem to have this this overbearing ability to, even without words, they seem to be able to threaten people by their very demeanour, the manner in which they look at people, the manner in which they treat people, and they're able to scare people to the point where people are incapable of doing anything to extricate themselves from the position they're in. Bearing in mind, Mrs. Connell and her children were bound at most of the time, and wouldn't have been able to get away anyway.
Cribb returns about an hour or so later with petrol for the car and continues his journey north, taking his 3 captives who are cold, hungry and frightened with him.
And at this point of time, the family, the mother and the 2 children, have been under his control, in his custody, for several hours. So you can imagine the fear and the apprehension that the mother would have been under.
Please, would you just let us go, please? We won't stay.
Even after her terrifying ordeal, Valda still tries to reason with Cribb to let her and the children go.
We just want to get
Shut
out
up.
of the car.
Shut up, I'm trying to think.
Just think about letting us go. Just
Look, do you want to
pull
go another
over.
round? Shut up.
Her pleas fall on deaf ears. Cribb keeps driving. He may appear to be just driving as far away as possible to avoid police, but in reality, he knows exactly where he's going and what he plans to do next.
You can let them go. I'll stay with you if you want. Just please.
I'm trying to think. Be quiet.
Valda Connell, Sally and young Damien have no idea what horrors and torment await them. Convicted armed robber John Ernest Cribb has abducted a mother and her 2 young children after a botched robbery at their Balcombe Hills home on the outskirts of Sydney. He's been driving them north, using back roads to avoid police. After running out of petrol near Central Mangrove, he forces 39-year-old Valda Connell to push the car into a secluded area and then brutally rapes her while her children are left bound and gagged in the car. It's now the early hours of Saturday morning, and Cribb drives to a picnic area at a place called Ellenborough Falls, near where his parents live at Killabark Creek. Cribb had only been to this exact location the week before, while on a family outing.
The interesting thing about that, it's interesting when you look at the characteristics of serial killers and killers generally, that they like to go to places where they've either been before or they've got some control. The reason he went to Ellenborough Falls is that he'd been there. He knew it well, and he'd been there a week before. So that in driving into this place at midnight, where no other person is there, it's pitch black, he still knew the area, he had control.
Please.
They stop there for a short while and then head for the township of Comboyne. 7 kilometres from the town, Cribb slows the car and tells Valda that this is where he'll leave her and the children. He even shows Valda where she needs to walk to get help. But Cribb is playing a game with his captives. He's teasing them. He doesn't stop at the drop-off point and continues on further, taking the car to an isolated bush clearing near Ellenborough Falls.
It was a dirt track, from memory, a bush dirt track. And at this stage, it's about 1 o'clock in the morning. It could be a little bit after that, but around about 1 o'clock in the morning. And he decides to leave them. My memory of it The mother and the two children are left together in the bush, several metres from the road in the pitch black.
Okay, you stay here overnight. Don't go anywhere. You can go into town in the morning, but you stay here.
They have no knowledge of where they are. They're unable to break free and unable to call for help. He now drives south towards Newcastle. He'd possibly intended to leave his victims to their fate, but as he drove, his thoughts got the better of him.
You have to go back. They're going to go to court. They know every single bloody detail.
Drove away and was indeed, for all intents and purposes, was on his way, leaving the scene and was going to leave them there alive, just bound and gagged in the bush. But he had second thoughts after only travelling a number of kilometres south, and we believe that this was because he'd had some discussions with Mrs. Connell in the car where he believed that he had identified himself certainly as John and maybe even further, and I think it scared him to the point where he thought, I'd best do something about this.
Again, Cribb's freedom is paramount. Fearing the mother would identify him to police, he drives back to the isolated bush clearing. The devil inside tells him he needs to silence his captives for good. No one knows what would have gone through Valda's mind when she saw the headlights. She might have hoped it was someone coming to rescue her, but any hope quickly fades when a familiar figure emerges. In Cribb's mind, murder is the only solution to his problems.
Mrs. Connell was facing him, bound and gagged, and he stabbed her in the centre of the chest. He stabbed her numerous times, and as best could be determined by the pathologist, 13 times.
And there were defence wounds on her body. So obviously there was some type of, even though she was gagged and bound, there was some type of struggle by her. Then he went to the little boy, the 4-year-old boy, and stabbed him twice and killed him. This left the little girl still alive. She witnessed this. She witnessed the mother being stabbed, and she witnessed the little brother being stabbed. And then he stabbed her, and I think from memory 6 times he stabbed her. All the wounds were from the front. So each of the people were approached from the front. They would have been fully aware of what was happening to them.
Terrifying is not a strong enough word, and I really don't know a word that would describe the horror that would have passed through her mind at the time she was being killed, and the absolute horror that the kids, the children, would have been experiencing seeing this happening to their mother. I just truly cannot think of words to describe what must have gone through their mind.
John Ernest Cribb has now gone from armed robber to a calculating, vicious murderer. After 10-year-old Sally has taken her last breath, Cribb surveys his handiwork as the bright beams filter through the scrub. Amazingly, his body is covered in so much blood and his adrenaline levels are so high, he's totally unaware that he stabbed himself in the finger and cut his leg during the frenzy. Now, comprehending the enormity of what he's done, he heads back to the vehicle. He sits in the car, quietly puffing on a cigarette, contemplating his next move. It isn't long before he decides to drive off, heading for his parents' house, just a short distance away.
He drove there about 2 in the morning. He tiptoes in the back door, gets some clothing. Must have washed up somewhere. The police are not aware of where. But after that, he went into his father's tool shed. On the way back to the car, picked up a shovel. He was going to bury them where he'd killed them. But when he got back, the ground was rock hard. He couldn't get the shovel in, so he dragged them to the car, put them in the boot with the idea of burying them on a sandy beach somewhere towards Newcastle.
Cribb drives the stolen car with Valda, Sally and Damien Connell's bodies in the boot towards Newcastle. He's now in a hurry and brazenly takes the Pacific Highway. He knows exactly how and where he plans to dispose of the bodies, but as he'll soon find out, not everything's going to go his way. After abducting and murdering 39-year-old Valda Connell and her 2 children, 10-year-old Sally and 4-year-old Damien, John Cribb transports their bodies in the family's stolen car, arriving at Caves Beach, just south of Newcastle, at around daybreak. Feeling he's alone, he begins to dig what is later described by police as an almost perfect grave.
And whilst he was digging the hole there, 2 little 12-year-old boys turned up on their push bikes. They're just riding through the bush. They disturbed him and they said, "What are you doing, mister?" And he said, "Oh, I'm digging a hole. I've got 3 dead Alsatians in the boot of the car and I want to bury them." The boys had a look at the car and they saw some property in the car, and I think they became a bit frightened, the boys, and they left the scene. And I think in hindsight it was good that they had left the scene, because anything could have happened.
The interruption unnerves Cribb, and he decides to pack up his shovel and move further along the beach. Cribb only drives a kilometre before he bogs the car in the soft sand. Using sticks and whatever else he can find close by, Cribb tries unsuccessfully to release the vehicle. Frustrated, he leaves the car and walks to the road. He hitches a ride to a service station near Caves Beach. Cribb soon arrives back with 2 tow truck operators who free the car from the sand.
The tow truck driver noticed that he had a cut finger. And obviously this cut finger was from this murder scene. He also had a wound on his leg as well. The tow truck driver said to him, "You better get that attended to."
Cribb goes to Belmont Hospital and receives 2 stitches to his finger. He abandons his plans to bury the bodies and drives to the Mawson Hotel at Caves Beach, where he spends the remainder of the morning and most of the afternoon drinking beer and talking to 2 locals. And no one, other than Cribb, is aware of the gruesome cargo concealed in the car.
He's had a beer with him and he's come up to us and said, "Do you mind if I sit down and talk to you? Have a chat?" He said, "No, go ahead." We sort of were looking at him because he had blood on his clothes, he had a bandage on his hand, and he sort of said to us, oh, I'd been up to his brother's place at Dungog or somewhere like that, rabbiting and getting the pelts, the rabbit pelts. And he said that's why, you know, he's cut his hand with the knife and blood from the rabbits.
As it got late into the evening, he decided to leave the hotel and he headed south towards Sydney along the Pacific Highway. Just somewhere near Swansea, I think it was from memory, he called into a service station to get some petrol and spoke to the fellow at the service station, and the fellow at the service station could smell the alcohol on his breath and just said to him, I don't think you should be driving. But anyway, Cribb got some petrol and he headed off towards Sydney.
But en route, just south of Caves Beach, he ran off the road and the vehicle went down into the scrub. He went back to the same garage and tried to engage the services of the same tow truck that had pulled him out of the bog situation back at Caves Beach earlier. So he then made arrangements for the vehicle to be towed out early the following morning, and then he went on his way back towards Wickham, which is a suburb just out of on the north side of Newcastle, to stay with some friends.
Soon after 7 o'clock on Sunday morning, Val de Connell's car is found down an embankment off the Pacific Highway, just south of Caves Beach. Inside the boot are the bound and gagged bodies of Val de Connell and her 2 young children. 3 tow truck operators make the grisly discovery when they try to retrieve the vehicle. As they pull the car up, its boot lid springs open, revealing its horrific secret. Police from Newcastle and surrounding areas rush to the scene. They quickly alert Sydney CIB.
It's a Sunday morning. It was about 20 to 9. We were all ready to go to church, 9 o'clock. And I remember looking out the window and seeing the homicide detective cars, because we could see probably a quarter of a mile away. And as I said, not much traffic that went by the road. We could see the homicide cars coming down, 3 of them. I knew straight away that we were going to get some news, and I guess I feared it would be bad.
And we had been told that morning that they'd been found and they were dead. And then I saw my uncle crying, and I said to somebody, why is Philip crying? And my auntie said, because his sisters died. But I was like in shock. I don't think I could actually take it in.
I can remember the knock on the door. I can remember someone crying out. And then I can remember one of the policemen, together with a dear cell brother, came up the stairs and took me into a room and said, they found your mother and brother and sister, and they've all been killed.
We were all told that they'd been found. I remember thinking, they're not coming home.
She was a mum that was always there for everybody, all 6 of us.
She's very feminine, very soft. Even with 6 kids, she would never go out of the house without lipstick on and without her hair done, and she was a very feminine lady.
Sally was a lovely little girl, always smiling. She was halfway between still a baby in some ways, but on the other hand, starting to become a young lady. It was great to have a brother finally come on the scene. There was a lot of fuss when he was born. A special little kid to me, probably because he was my only brother.
I could almost see it was just the end of the world. Our whole world was dragged out from underneath us. because nothing functioned in our home again.
Cribb kidnapped and raped Mrs. Connell, tied up all three and methodically stabbed them to death.
The Pacific Highway south of Newcastle becomes a crime scene, and homicide detectives Mike Hagan and Rick Campbell make their way from Sydney.
Can I say that in 31 years of policing, 10 years of those at homicide, and having attended numerous homicide scenes, attended the scenes of death and all sorts of things, it was probably the most horrific sight that I have ever seen in my life, without doubt.
The bodies are eventually transported to the morgue, while the Holden Kingswood is taken to Newcastle Police Station for closer forensic examination. There are blood smears on the steering wheel, and fingerprints are found on the stolen property belonging to the Connells, including the shotgun, which is retrieved from the back seat of the car. The tow truck driver tells police about the driver's cut finger and how he sent the driver of the car to Belmont Hospital to have it seen to. Police go to the hospital, and amazingly, they find the man with the cut finger has identified himself as John Ernest Cribb. They quickly match Cribb's prints on record with those found at the Connell house and on the stolen property. Police now have their man, and a full description is sent to police and the media across the state. A manhunt begins. By midday, reports of the triple murders head the news bulletins, along with a description of the wanted man. Meanwhile, Cribb is visiting friends at a house in Throsby Street, Wickham. He's slept there overnight and spends Sunday hanging around the house. Two visitors to the house, Bettina and Kerry Edson, ask him about the bloodstains on his clothing, and Cribb quickly replies he's been kangaroo shooting. He also tells them he's smashed his car.
Before I left home is when I heard the radio announcement of the police were looking for this dangerous person, Australian, gave his age, gave a description of what he was wearing, jeans and flannelette T-shirt and stuff. And in particular, they mentioned about silver rings he had on and a silver bracelet. And I was just checking him out and looking at the jewellery and looking at him, and asked him some questions about where he'd been, and he said he'd been out ruse shooting. He wanted to go get his car. There was something in the car that he didn't want the police to find. And just things didn't add up, and I just started thinking, this is the guy, definitely, that they're looking for.
And they made a phone call, but in the meantime, Cribb had left that house with his friends and gone to another house in Union Street in the same suburb. We knocked on the door and gained entry by telling the people at that house that he'd been involved in an accident and he wanted to use the telephone. Immediately he went inside. There was an elderly lady and her daughter present at the house. He wasn't in there long when I believe two male neighbours then came, and they whisked the daughter away from the house, but Cribb then grabbed the elderly lady and dragged her into the laundry area of the house. And it was at about this time the police cars started pulling me out the front.
It was a police siege of some magnitude and went from late afternoon till the wee hours of the morning. By this time, after midnight, things settled down. Two big, burly police officers crashed through the back door, grabbed him. He was sitting on the floor with a blanket around his shoulders, and a washing machine jammed against the door. They had to push past. The victim beside him, she wasn't hurt. They grabbed him, wrestled him, and handcuffed him face down onto the concrete.
When police burst into the house, Cribb attempted to stab himself in the chest. He's taken to Newcastle's John Hunter Hospital, but is soon released with a superficial wound. He's then taken to Newcastle Police Station, where he's interviewed. When asked why, after the botched break and enter, he didn't just take the car and escape, Cribb tells detectives he took Valda and her children because he was afraid they'd go to police. Cribb is cooperative and even agrees to take police on what was then referred to as a runaround. Handcuffed to a detective, Cribb returns to each of the locations he took Valda Connell and her children, retracing his every move. Cribb is charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 of rape, and the court schedules a committal hearing for November 1978. With Cribb's confession, the mounting forensic evidence and witnesses, the case for the prosecution appears airtight. But not everything goes to plan, and nor is this the end of Cribb's reign of terror. In November 1978, Cribb appears before the Newcastle Court of Petty Sessions. The evidence is overwhelming, and Cribb is remanded to face trial. The magistrate also requests that Cribb undergo a psychiatric evaluation. He's interviewed by a prison psychiatrist and is diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. The authorities transfer Cribb for treatment to Morisset Hospital, a psychiatric facility on Lake Macquarie between Sydney and Newcastle.
On the 4th of April 1979, Rick and I were in the homicide office at the Central CIB, and we were informed that John Ernest Cribb had escaped from Morisset Hospital. My understanding was that 4 people had escaped from Morisset, 2 had been recaptured, and there was 2 criminals still on the run, William Munday and John Cribb.
I remember saying to Dad, one-on-one, what happens if he does come back to our house again? What do we do? And I remember Dad looking at me and saying, well, I hope he does, and I hope I get a chance to get my hands on him. And I realised that I didn't have to be worried because, yeah, certainly that's probably what he deserved.
Over 2 weeks, Cribb and Mundy commit over 30 offences, including assaults and robberies in Newcastle and Sydney. There's mention of them nearly every day in the papers and across radio and television newscasts. Before they're finally caught, they abducted 2 teenage schoolgirls, holding them captive and repeatedly raping them for 35 hours. Cribb is found fit to plead and to stand trial on the 22nd of May, 1979. The weight of evidence is so strong that Cribb quickly pleads guilty. However, his defence counsel raises the issue of his mental state and asks the court, was Cribb in his right mind when he killed Valda, Sally and Damien? After listening to expert witnesses, Justice Roden dismisses Cribb's mental health as grounds for defence. For the murders of 39-year-old Valda Connell, 10-year-old Sally and 4-year-old Damien, Justice Roden sentences John Ernest Cribb to 3 life terms in prison.
I think Cribb was a cold, ruthless, calculating individual. He was a person devoid of the normal feelings of a human being. He displayed a very cool, calm, calculating demeanour, and he showed absolutely no remorse for what he'd done.
one of the things that I think we experienced, which was even more painful, is that you would have beautiful dreams. And you would have dreams about the good times. But then you would wake up and realise that your life had become a nightmare. And that's what the day would be. So that was certainly difficult. But you had to cope, you had to get on.
Now, you'd have thought this would be the end of the matter, but it isn't. In 1990, two things happen. Cribb marries a 22-year-old sister of a fellow inmate, and the New South Wales government introduces truth in sentencing. So, like many other prisoners serving life sentences that were handed down prior to 1990, Cribb applies to have his sentence redetermined.
Cribb's wife and family left without comment.
His application is heard before Justice Newman in the Supreme Court in 1993. Cribb claims, with the support of religious leaders, mental health workers, and even some prison guards, that he's reformed and wants to live a normal life and care for his now sick wife. With his application, Cribb writes a letter explaining his reasons for killing Valda, Sally, and Damien. He claims that Valda had told him 10 years prior to the murders that he was Sally's father and that she had since denied it. Justice Newman is scathing of the letter, describing it as grotesque lies and only further evidence of Cribb's lack of contrition and heartless lack of sympathy for his victims. Cribb's application is rejected. He makes a second application in 2008, but withdraws it the day before it's scheduled for hearing.
In this last hearing, he didn't turn up. He put our family through the agony of preparing, of reliving the drama, and then the night before pulled the pin.
Under the truth in sentencing legislation, Cribb and others like him could apply for redetermination every 3 years.
This meant that for families like us, not only did you have to go through the tragedy back in 78, again when he escaped in 79, again when he made application in the mid-90s, and then again this year, but we could be faced with having to go through this every 3 years for the rest of his life.
Determined to keep her killer locked up.
So it ended up that the law was changed, not just for the Connell family, but for many other families who, once again, the murderer had the power. And so the law was changed very quickly. Both the opposition and the government had no qualms in passing this legislation that meant that the murderer can apply for a redetermination of their sentence once more. And after that, it would be up to the judge's discretion whether they spent the rest of their lives in jail or whether they got a determinate sentence.
Since its inception in 1993, Martha Jabor and the Homicide Victims Support Group have helped thousands of people who've been affected by murder.
I think Martha's like an angel out there. She helped me so much. 30 years on, I wish Martha had been around in 1978. Sadly for us, there was no help. We were meant to just get on with things.
And we're with the family forever. There are no timelines. There's not a time limit on how long a person can be with the Homicide Victims Support Group. We're here, we're set up for life. And so we're there for them for the rest of their lives.
One of the hardest things for me throughout this whole process is to also see the pain and the grief that it's caused my dad. Sometimes people will say to me, how do you survive such a horrible day? And clearly I've had nights and times where I've cried and cried. And as bad as it is to lose a mother and a brother and a sister, I think to lose your wife and your 2 children would be 10 times worse. On many, many times, my dad has been my inspiration. I've seen him keep it together. I've seen him battle and get through life. And I figure if he can keep doing that and moving forward, well, then certainly I should be able to as well.
For the people out there, the do-gooders and the people that believe in rehabilitation, for anyone that's watching, are the people with the responsibility in the courts, that they must never forget the magnitude of this crime. And I stand here because of what my mother went through, and because of what we all went through, and because of the struggle, and because of what my dad went through. And so many people that were affected on that day.
Murder is something that kills the victims straight away, but lives within the victims' families forever. It is something that doesn't go away. And not only do you lose those loved ones, as you would perhaps in a tragic accident, but there are constant reminders. You know, when you hear the word murder, when every Mother's Day, when you have occasions, when as a family, you know, when my 2 children were born. Your mother in particular is someone there who is should be a special part of your life. And to have her snatched away by the selfish, bastarded act by someone like John Cribb is a pain that just goes on forever.
On the next episode of Crime Investigation Australia, we recall the story of one of the country's most vicious serial killers. One of his victims, a 9-year-old schoolgirl, the predator Leonard John Fraser. Next month on Crime Investigation Australia.